Alright, hello everybody. Welcome to our kind of first lesson here in terms of content. Our first unit we're going to focus on for this class is looking at kind of life at the end of the 1800s, after the Civil War and things like that. So we're really going to start about 1880 or so, leading up to the 1900s. So that's kind of where we're starting at to give you an idea of the timeline, okay? So our first lesson here is going to talk about incoming immigrants. Excuse me. So our objectives and standards are to understand the new wave of immigrants that came to the United States at the end of the 1800s and also early 1900s as well, and to analyze restrictions placed on immigrants in the United States. I'm going to take a moment there to read the standards, please, if you would. Okay. And our desired result, remember, this is part of your weekly review assignment, and also just keep that in mind and make sure to include this. So, excuse me, what struggles did new groups of immigrants face? Some vocab here. We have melting pot, which is a mixing of different people, cultures, and races who blend together by abandoning their native ways and customs. And nativism, which is favoring native-born citizens over foreign-born citizens. So looking for a better life. During the late 1800s and early 1900s, there's millions of immigrants that are going to come to the United States. And we'll take a look at where they specifically come from in a little bit, but they come for different reasons. Some of them, it's famine, such as hunger or needing food. Others, it's land shortages, not having enough land in their home countries to farm or work on, so they are coming to the United States to try and get some land. For others, it's political and religious persecution. Maybe they were being persecuted or attacked for their political views or their religious views. And for many others as well, it's also money and jobs. Their countries don't have many jobs, or they can't find work, and they know the United States has a lot of opportunities in that area. So Europeans. 20 million Europeans came to the United States between 1870 and 1920. And I know for a fact from my own personal history that on my mom's side and my dad's side, that this is when my family ancestors came over, is between 1870 and 1920 for the most part. So maybe you know something about your own family history, or you can talk to people in your family to see when they came over. Now, prior to 1890, many Europeans came from Western and Northern countries. We're talking about places like England, France, Germany, Ireland, places like that. Starting in 1890, however, many Europeans began arriving from southern and eastern countries, places like Italy, Greece, Russia, Poland, places like that. Now, their reasons for coming to the U.S., like we had said in the previous slide, included escaping religious or political persecution, land, jobs, and even just looking for a sense of being independent. Okay, so that's also part of it too, of, maybe they don't have a lot of freedoms in their country, so they're looking for more freedoms here in the United States. And now the Japanese and the Chinese. Chinese and Japanese immigrants settled along the western coast of the United States. So while many Europeans were settling in places like New York, Philadelphia, Boston, those places, the Japanese and the Chinese were settling in places like San Francisco or Los Angeles. Immigrants from China began arriving around the 1850s during the California Gold Rush. You can see a picture of that here of some Chinese immigrants in California and on the western coast here during the time period. Many Chinese immigrants were responsible for helping to build the Transcontinental Railroad. They also farmed, they mined, and they also ran their own businesses as well. However, Chinese immigration and Chinese immigrants would be discriminated against, and they would be limited by Congress in 1882, and we'll talk a little bit about that here in a little bit. Japanese immigrants began arriving in the United States around 1898 after Hawaii was annexed or taken over by the United States. So more immigrant groups. So between 1880 and 1920, immigrant groups also came from places like the West Indies. Now, about 260,000 Jamaicans, Cubans, Puerto Ricans, and other islanders settled in the eastern and southeastern United States, and many were also looking like other immigrants were, looking for jobs and money. And there were also many Mexicans who immigrated to the U.S. during this time to escape political turmoil. Mexico was going through a civil war at the time, so they were looking to get away from that, and also for jobs. And about 700,000 Mexicans immigrated to the United States beginning after 1910, again, kind of during their Civil War, until about 1930. So here's a map here which shows you the number of immigrants and where they were from 1880 to 1930. So again, we can see here, let me get a different color here. So we can see here that a lot of the European countries are coming to the eastern side of the United States, right? We can see Norway and Sweden, Russia, Ireland, France, Germany, Poland, Austria, Hungary, and Italy, okay? And then again, a lot of the more Asian immigrants from Japan and China settling along the western coast of the United States. I'll give you a minute there to look at that real quick. So getting to the United States, excuse me, by the 1870s, most immigrants traveled to the United States by steamship or by boat, okay? Now, typically it was a 1-week trip across the Atlantic Ocean from Europe, and it was a 3-week trip across the Pacific Ocean from China or Japan. Now, most immigrants, unfortunately, had very little money, and they had to travel in steerage. Steerage is typically at the bottom of the ship. They had to travel, it was crowded, it was dirty, it was smelly, it was cramped, so they didn't have a lot of money, so that's where they had to travel. And unfortunately, some immigrants did become ill and did die along the journey as well. So inspection. Many immigrants now face the fear of not being allowed to enter the United States, so just getting to the United States was not enough. They had to pass certain tests at inspection stations, such as Castle Garden, which was later known as, maybe you've heard of this before, Ellis Island in New York. Doctors examined passengers for health problems or diseases that could result in being denied entry. If they passed the health examination, they would move on to legal inspection to prove that they were not a criminal, they had enough money to support themselves here in the United States, and other legal requirements as well. Now, Japanese and Chinese immigrants typically entered through Angel Island in the San Francisco Bay in California. Same type of process a little bit as Ellis Island, but different from Ellis Island. Immigrants at Angel Island faced a little more tough questioning and were often detained for longer periods of time in filthy shacks. Now, once immigrants, if they were lucky enough to be admitted, they still faced a lot of struggles afterwards. Many needed to find jobs, they needed to find a place to live, and they also, in some cases, needed to learn a new language and a new culture. Typically, immigrants would settle with same or other cultural groups who would assist them. Places like Chinatown, you may have heard of that. We begin to see these little cultural regions pop up in cities such as Little Italy, Chinatown, and this is where many immigrants would go and live together to help each other. And these groups also helped collect money to build churches or synagogues, social clubs, cemeteries, and they even established their own newspapers as well. So, rising tensions. So, of course, similar to today in some views, there are, with the discussion of immigration, there were many native-born Americans who wanted new immigrants to join this so-called melting pot of the United States. Become American, don't speak your language, learn English, give up your old ways. But many of these immigrants did not want to give up their cultures. And this is going to create tension between both groups in the United States. So one response to immigration was nativism, and nativism led to anti-immigration groups, and it also called for immigration restrictions. Now, many nativists did not object to immigrants from certain countries, however. They kind of had a prejudice. Many of them were more accepting of immigrant groups from what we call Anglo-Saxon background or Germanic ancestors who were Germanic ancestors of the English. So they were more accepting of people from like England or Germany. They weren't really accepting of Italians, Irish, Jewish, Chinese, Japanese, anyone who really didn't fit the model of what Americans thought immigrants should be. Nativists believed that the problems in the United States were caused by other immigrant groups, so that's why many of them didn't want them here. Religion was also another major concern of many Americans. Many Americans were Protestant. So they were not Catholic. They're Christian, but they were not Catholic. And they did not want Catholics or Jewish undermining society. There were also anti-Catholic attacks, and many colleges, social clubs, and businesses would not even admit those who were Jewish. So government responds. Influenced by the Immigration Restriction League, Congress passed a bill in 1897 requiring literacy tests for immigrants. So those who could not read 40 words in English or even their native language were denied entry. Now, this was vetoed or denied by President Grover Cleveland, but it did send a strong anti-immigrant message to immigrants, saying that, they weren't maybe welcome here if they weren't able to meet certain tasks. Now, a very similar bill was passed in 1917 against the wishes of President Woodrow Wilson. So, immigrants from Asia. Anti-immigrant sentiment was strong in the labor movement. Now, many Native born Americans felt that these immigrants would steal their jobs, and this was especially true along the West Coast, where workers feared that Chinese immigrants would accept lower wages or lower pay for work. So people would hire these Asian immigrants instead of Americans, so that was a major concern of theirs. During the Depression of 1873, anti-Chinese sentiment reached a boiling point, and in fact, in 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed by Congress that banned entry of Chinese immigrants, except those who were students, teachers, merchants, government officials, and tourists for at least 10 years. And the law was actually extended in 1892 and also in 1902, and it was extended every 10 years indefinitely. In 1902 it was extended indefinitely until finally it was repealed in 1943. Some other restrictions. Fear of Chinese immigrants soon spread to Japanese and other Asian immigrants. In 1906, for example, the San Francisco Local Board of Education segregated schools by placing Japanese children in separate ones. Japan became very frustrated with this, with the treatments of immigrants to the United States. So President Theodore Roosevelt worked out a deal that became known as the Gentleman's Agreement of 1907-1908, where Japan would restrict immigration of unskilled workers to the U.S. in exchange for repeal of segregated schools. So Japan agreed that they would send people with higher skills or higher educations to the United States if the U.S. would repeal this segregated school system. Alright, so kind of wrapping up here, our closure. What struggles did new groups of immigrants face? Obviously, think about their challenges to get here, their challenges upon arrival here, such as inspection and trying to find and figure out their way in this new culture and society, and then what other restrictions did they face and discrimination did they face from Americans? Okay, so that will help you answer your question. Be sure to include that on your weekly review there, and I hope you have a great rest of your day or night, and I will talk to you soon.